As we continue speedily going through the second half of Joshua, it's on one hand, there are some relatively boring parts. On the other hand, it goes quickly. And I think there's some interesting things to talk about, despite the long list. We continue to study during this horrible war that continues and does not look like it's getting any better soon. And we hope and we pray for an end to the hostilities, bringing home of the hostages, at the same time, the end of the suffering for the people of Gaza. We also, at least I personally hope for a change in the government that once again passed a horrible budget, wartime budget, just today, and further cementing the damage that's been done by this particular government, not just the war itself. So our study today is on the background of the war, as you will see. The two of the passages that we get to, I think, have relevance, and we dedicate our study to Ilui Nishmotehem, to the raising of those souls who have perished, and the raising of our own souls and our spirits. Okay. Are there any comments or questions from last week or the week before? You have no excuse by not being able to come, because you can always catch up on YouTube, on the recordings. Anyway, yeah, let's begin. Susie, you want to do 16, 1 to 4 first? We have 2 chapters today. We're going to start with, this is Ephraim and Mennasheh, the 2 sons according to the story of Joseph, but they are treated as independent tribes here. Go ahead.
The portion that fell by lot to the Josephites ran from the Jordan at Jericho, from the waters of Jericho east of the wilderness. From Jericho it ascended through the hill country to Bethel. From Bethel it ran to Luz and passed on to the territory of the Archites at Etrog. Descended westward to the territory of the Japhetites, as far as the border of lower Beth Horon and Gezer, and ran on to the sea. Thus the Josephites, that is, Manasseh and Ephraim, received their portion.
Okay. The language of Yatzah Goral or Veitzeh Goral, the portion that fell by lot, this refers to 2 possible things. One, back to Numbers, where the traditions by lot. By the way, we didn't talk about this last week. It was Judah, and in general, Judah and Ephraim and Mennasheh are placed before the rest of the tribes because of their importance in history. And so it either relates to the drawing of lots for the land in Numbers, the way it's told, or it relates to something that's coming later on. There'll be a recap of that at the end of the book of Joshua. So we don't know exactly, and the truth is, in reading and preparing, unfortunately, not as nearly as much as I would like to. This is one of those mornings where I apologize for not being as prepared as I would like to be. But in looking especially at Shmuel Achituv's commentary in Hebrew, which is one of the newer ones, certainly in Hebrew, maybe the newest of the commentaries on Joshua, he places the time of this composition of our section today probably in the time of Solomon, because it reflects all the things, and this comes back to all the various cities, the magnitude of cities that were mentioned last week, that we'll see here, reflect this kind of very optimistic border of the land. And as we know, the largest territorial claim was in the time of Solomon. And so this may, or others think it's just wishful thinking, but it's not supported by archaeology. Now, there is an interesting thing of archaeology, which it doesn't really have to do so much with our text today. It's not one of the major points, But before that, though, I forgot to ask. Yeah, what do people? I'm sorry, not too well focused. How do we? Does anybody have any comments or questions about this section before I go ahead with what I've prepared? Does anything stick out? Any place names? It's difficult to pronounce some of the names, but there's some place names here. Anything? You know what? Let me also throw up the map that I think the same map we were using yesterday, last week. So you see, we were doing Judah last week, and now it goes up to Ephraim and Mennasheh. It talked about the northern border, and here it's a very fuzzy border here that we'll see because it was probably interchanging between families here. It was not a clear border as clear as there was, say, between Ephraim and Judah or Benjamin. Anyway, this is the overall area that we're talking about. Okay. Comments?
Bethel and Luz struck me as being from Genesis, from Bereshit.
Right, but
Important places.
so there's an issue of translation here that not everybody
Right.
agrees upon. Say mi Beit El Luza. The hey
Right.
at the end of Luza is like Artsa Alinu, right? We've gone to. It's a dative, a locative, locative. I forgot the grammatical term now, but it means to go to that place. So it could mean from, as translated here, from Beit El to Luz, or it could be, as the Septuagint translates here, in two words, Bethel Luz. Bethel Luza, I think. Bethel Luza. In other words, that's the name of the place. And what supports the fact? I know this is not all that important. What supports between Beit El and Luza is the way that we have it in the Masoretic text here. That's the way the vocalization would go. And also, we don't know of a place named Luza. We know of a place named Luz. But what would support, going back to you, Malka, what would support reading this as the same name?
You mean Bethel Luza?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because in the story in Genesis, it says the name before Beit El, it used to be called Luz.
Oh, right.
Right. So, and that to me is, what is it like? Tel Aviv Yafo. It's two places, but it's the city of Tel Aviv Yafo. The city is not Tel Aviv officially. The city is the city of Tel Aviv Yafo. Because they're under the same, they were brought together. Or here it's different because I don't know what would it be like here. I don't know. There's probably good examples here. Idlewild, Pinecrest. I don't know. I don't know. In any case, that's not on the point. But yes, that's reminiscent of place names in Genesis. What other names? Anybody recognize the name Gezer? So Harold would love this. Too bad Harold's not. Gezer, which means carrot, right? But Gezer is there's a lot of things that are famous about Gezer. First, I'm going to start going backwards. The captain of the first Israeli baseball team in the Olympics. And who knew that the Olympics had baseball? When I was a kid, I don't think the Olympics had baseball, but there's baseball in the Olympics now, and Israel has a team, and the captain of that team grew up in Gezer, Kibbutz Gezer. And I know that not so much because I follow baseball, Israeli or otherwise, or the Olympics for that matter, but because he's the son of a colleague of mine who is one of the first female reform rabbis in Israel. And she and her husband, who's an educator, are friends. I guess we're not close friends. And she made history because she was able to receive funding from the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Oh, this is already probably 15 years ago. Maybe, probably about 15 years ago, for being the rabbi of the era, the regional rabbi. As a woman, as a reform rabbi, it was like a Supreme Court case and everything. So that's Miri. Um, uh, uh, her husband is David Leichman, and I'm blanking on Mary's last name right now. Kibbutz Gezer has a lot of Americans in it, and my good friend Rabbi Levi Wyman Kelman and Paula, his wife, they were married there, and so there was I think a Garin, an American Garin that helped revitalize that kibbutz. But Gezer is famous for another reason because nearby is Tel Gezer, the hill, right, the archaeological hill of Gezer. And Gezer was an important town in the second millennium BCE. And it's mentioned on an important inscription in Egypt. It was at the crossroads of Egypt and Mesopotamia. It sits right there. Gezer is, which is interesting because it's not the territory that we think of it. Gezer is down here. Gezer would be, no, it's not on the map, but Gezer would be around here, around this area here. So it's kind of halfway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And it's and one of the most important reasons is because there's a lovely archaeological find in Tel Gezer. And then I'm going to show you as well. Has anybody heard of the calendar of Gezer? Malka, you ever run into that?
I did. It was a famous Canaanite calendar with the agricultural.
Yeah, let me get it here. I think I still have it. I meant to have it ready. Sorry. Devil fools with the best laid plans. Oh, let me do this way. Here we go. You can see and I know I don't do this often, it's just because I remember we had to learn this. I think maybe it was in biblical Hebrew in my first year. We had to look at this for a number of reasons. This is this clay thing that was found, and you can see right. So that's an ancient, looks like gibberish, right? It's ancient Canaanite script. The scholars, I think, debate whether it's Hebrew, an earlier form of Proto-Hebrew, whether it's Phoenician. One way or another, though, it's our language, right? And so you can see the transcript over here. That's the older alphabet. This is in the alphabet letters that we know, the alphabet letters we know. So you see here, Yerech. Yerech is month. Yeah, let's just go down to the translation. Sorry, should have
But
went.
Asaph is gathering here.
But here is so 2 months of gathering, and that in Hebrew is Tishrei Cheshvan, 2 months of planting. So if I go back up here, Asaph is to gather, Yerech Vizera is to seed, plant the seeds. Yerech is to I don't know. Anyway, because it has to do with cutting flat or late sowing. I don't know that word, but whatever it is, it's like this it's almost poetic, and so some scholars think that it's a song that was inscribed on this clay tablet. Some people say it's just a school kids exercise. Whatever it is, though, it gave us already from, and it's dated, I think, 10th or 11th century BCE. It gave us a certain form of writing of Hebrew, of ancient Hebrew, and it gave us the names of the months that we use, which are not the months, and this is the important part here, which are not the months that are in the Torah. Because the months in the Torah, as I think everybody here knows, are the first month, the second month, the third month. The months that we use, the names of the months we use, like we're in Adar now, and Nisan coming up is Nisan is the first month, Adar is the 12th month. Those names are Babylonian names, and they're named after Mesopotamian gods. Much like our name, the names of our English months are also named after gods, right? I'm guessing all of them, but certainly many of them. Okay, so
Question. Ephraim and Mennasheh, they were half tribes. Why did they get just about as much land allotment as the other tribes?
yeah, So that's a really, really important question, Malcolm, because it having to do with the reconstructed history, or the fabricated and the refabricated history of the tribes of Israel. You know, and others perhaps you've heard before, that according to some scholars, there never was an exodus from Egypt and a conquering of the land. There was an idea of peoplehood that was, and so there was certain conquered land, but it was reconstructed, fabricated history that came hundreds of years after it was supposed to have happened, that tell of this happening and division into different tribes. There were different tribes, different people that believed in either Elohim or Yud He Vav He, but one God. They all ascribe to themselves, or somebody ascribed to them, being the descendants of Abraham and Isaac, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah, etc. And then when you get to Joseph, there were those that said, well, there's Joseph was one of the 12, and those said, well, no, not exactly. The Levites were separate, and the 12 were independent. In order to get to 12, you have to include both sons of Joseph. So what's really difficult to do, Malka, and I think probably someone like the Malbim, from late 19th century Eastern European commentary, who loves to harmonize, probably has something to say this fact, but you can't really interface everything that's happening here with the stories in Genesis. So your question comes out of a naive, I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, of course, in any way, but a simple question that any person would ask. Well, but there were two sons, so why should they get? Well, they're given. Joseph is treated as if he's the firstborn and gets double the portion. That's part of this. At least looking backwards, that's the impression that we're being given. But it could also just reflect some sort of a reality in the field that was afterwards imposed upon historical narrative. So I think it's really hard to say anything. To me, so I guess the simplest answer I would give, Malka, would be what the text is trying to say, is that Joseph was considered the Bechor, the firstborn, and he got double the portion. Does that convince?
Yes, not convincing, but it's something to think about. Okay. The other thing I noticed is that Mount Gerizim was in Mennasheh.
Yeah. So Mount Gerizim is important for the Samaritans, and there are those that feel that this has been some of the place names here were mentioned, including this, because it's part of the polemic at some point between those that were Jerusalem-centered descendants of Israelites and those that were Samaritan, Mount Gerizim centered. That's a fascinating topic unto its own. Achitu doesn't go that way, in that direction. He doesn't think this is part of a polemic, but scholars have said so. So it's fascinating how much material has been written about these chapters that, for us, at least for me, are lackluster, are not as attractive. Sorry, projecting my own. I know that Richard loves these kind of things because in many ways it's like accounting, right? It's like bookkeeping. Just get it in the right category, in the right file, and he's happy. Right, Richard?
The right file makes me happy.
There you go. So why don't you read 5 to 10? And there's any other comments or questions about this section? Go ahead, Richard.
The territory of the Ephraimites by their clans was as follows. The boundary of their portion ran from Atroth Adar on the east to the upper Beth Horon, and the boundary ran on to the sea. And on the north, the boundary proceeded from Michmethah to the east of Tanath Shiloh and passed beyond it up to the east of Genoa. And from Genoa, it descended to Adaroth and Narath, touched on Jericho, and ran on to the Jordan. Westward, the boundary proceeded from Tepoa to the Wadi Kana and ran on to the sea. This was the portion of the tribe of the Ephraimites by their clans, together with the towns marked off for the Ephraimites within the territory of the Mennashites, all those towns with their villages. However, they failed to dispossess the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites remained in the midst of Ephraim, as it is still the case, but they had to perform forced labor.
Okay, we'll get to that last part in a moment, but before that, any place names familiar, any associations? For me, with my own personal history in Israel, or in this case, the land of Israel, there's with every paragraph, every section, there's at least one or two things that remind me of things in my life or connections, like the baseball story with Gezer, or a particular hike that I took. We used to do a lot of hiking when I was younger, and when 18 onward, during the yeshiva army years, we went out a lot. We hitchhiked, we went out to a wadi, walked it, whatever it was, for a day, and then came out and hope we got a ride back to wherever we needed to go. And so there are a lot of places that are mentioned that I feel, that I've been to. There was a functioning airport. I don't know what it serves now today. I don't really know what the status is. North of Jerusalem, did anybody ever fly into Atarot? So there, Arkia had flights from. You could go from. I think I went once from Jerusalem to Eilat. There was a flight that went from Jerusalem to Eilat. I don't know if there were flights from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, because until you get in the airplane, you get down, it's, you could drive faster. But and then I think that changed in the Oslo Accords. I think perhaps that changed. I don't really know. Maybe it's an army base. Sorry, I didn't look it up. But Atarot is, was known for a long time. It's between Jerusalem and Ramallah. Another place that for me and Sasha has meaning, a little bit less for Sasha, she was less involved, but there's a place called Tapuach, which means apple. But Tapuach, when Sasha and I left Gan Or in the Gaza Strip, which was at Netzarim in the Gaza Strip, someone had passed our name along to the membership committee of Tapuach, and they actually sought after us, wanted to interview us and invite us for Shabbat. We would perhaps, that's what happens in the early stage of a settlement of a communal farm, especially. I don't think Tapuach had that much farming, but there's a committee whose job is to get more members, like there are in other organizations. And it was very flattering for them to run after us. And we thought of it, but I was starting Hebrew University, so let's put off everything else for right now. Of course, that 1 year of study at Hebrew University turned into 11 years of study, Hebrew University in Shechter. And then I was quite happy a few years later, because I think there was some involvement with people in Tapuach. There was certainly settler violence there, and I think there was some involvement with the Jewish the terrorists. There was a number of episodes of Jewish terrorism over the last 50 years. Some of them more famous than others. That is, actual cases of Jews getting together to kill, to murder Palestinians, bombs in schools and things like that. Thankfully, a lot of that, it was thwarted over the years by the Shin Bet, that is the Secret Service, whatever, I don't know what the translation would be. The guys in Faude, right, that you see in the TV series, which, by the way, is a new season is coming out, which is going to reflect October 7th. It's going to be very painful. And you also may know that one of the stars in Faude, I don't know how many people have seen that series. I think it was on Netflix, but one of the stars of Faude was in reserve duty and was injured. So that was big news in Israel, right? He came out and okay. So that's Tapuach. And of course, Jericho and places that over the years we've driven through, walked through, been through at different times of political, social situations over 36 years.
I think it bears mentioning that I'm a graduate of Jericho High School.
It does. So that's interesting. So Long Island had a Jericho.
Yeah, and that's where I grew up, and I graduated high school there.
Okay, and do you think it has anything to do with your personality?
Everything.
Yeah. Okay.
I spent my life looking for Betua.
Okay.
It's supposed to be the next town over, but it's actually, as far as I know, it was Syosset.
Or Jamaica, isn't that on the way?
No, Jamaica's no. That's over the Jordan, so it's far away.
Okay.
It's far away.
Palm Springs, right?
What's that?
Now you conquered Palm Springs.
Exactly.
Well, actually, Richard does live in a walled city.
Although I will say this too, the next town, another town bordering Jericho is Woodbury, and there's actually two Woodburys in the state of New York. You asked that, I think, in one of the previous classes.
Good to know.
So that's the Jericho's claim to fame is being next to a town with the duplicate towns in the state of New York.
Right, but I want to get back to the walled city that you live in at the northern end of Palm Springs.
Yeah.
It's literally a neighborhood that has a wall around it, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, yeah. So if you see a bunch of people marching around with shofars, you know it's time to pack up. Okay, apropos North Tel Aviv yesterday, I was at a really, really encouraging, a local glimmer of light. The official opening of the resource center that has been planned and talked about. I was part of a committee that began to plan it in 2016, 2015, 2016, 17. Went to these, I don't know if there were monthly meetings or quarterly meetings of a homeless kind of commission, homelessness commission. And one of the things that came up right away is the need for a center which offers wraparound services. And some of you remember Roy's house closed down around that time. There was nowhere for people in great need to go to find a bed. So now there is 50 beds are available right now, but in August they'll open the entire facility, which is not far from Richard's house. It's kind of an industrial area, MacArthur, something like MacArthur. It was really encouraging, beautifully designed. There'll be homes there for initial living and ways for people to get, ways for people that are interested in getting off the street that are able to, from an emotional, a mental health point of view, be off the street. And very, very encouraging. It was a good day in Palm Springs yesterday to see some progress. It's one more thing that can happen. And any news article it says, well, yes, of course, it's just a drop in the bucket. Well, yeah, it's a drop in the bucket, but if we don't, try to gather all those drops, we're never going to get anywhere. So happy to see that drop in the bucket. Okay. Anything else? Oh, this last part. Okay. This is the difficult part, folks, right? This is a difficult thing for us to read as 20th, 21st century Jews growing up in a free society, not being part of manifest destiny. We're part of it because we're white and we live in America, and that's part of who we are and what we have, but not at least feeling actively involved in manifest destiny and of conquering other people. But just the way of the language here is, v'lo horishu et haknani, which starts out in neutral side, and they were not able to dispossess the Canaanites that were sitting in Gezer. And that goes back to what I said before. Gezer was an important town. The idea that Joshua came in with the people and conquered everybody, we already understand that. That didn't happen everywhere. But the places it was natural for it not to happen were the strong city states. And Gezer was one of those places. Not so easy, right? And also the story of Gezer comes up again in Samuel or Kings, don't remember which. There's a story about how the Egyptians, I think, sacked Gezer at that time. Excuse me. And then it says, oh, sorry, I've got to get some water. I'm actually thinking about the second time this happens. The next comment, so remind me, I have another comment about when the same phrase kind of comes up again. But this idea that we couldn't get rid of them, so it's kind of like, well, we'll be damned, they're just going to live amongst it freely. They're not going to live freely. They will pay tribute. The language of the mas oved, mas is a tax tribute. It's they had to pay. I don't. Homage is not financial, right? So they had to pay tribute. I get tribute is that they had to pay tribute. They wanted to live there, continue to live there. So it's an interesting situation. They couldn't get them out, so they stayed in, but they still had to pay for being in. It's kind of a if they're paying to be in, why not just get them out? But they couldn't get them out. So then if they couldn't get them out, they can make them pay. I guess I don't know exactly. It could be just wishful thinking, looking backwards, but it's not a pleasant thing. In other words, either we get rid of you, we take your land, or if you stay, then you're going to become slaves. I mean, it doesn't say slave avdut, but masoved is could very well be not just tribute, but it could also be enslaved. So it depends on the translation that you get here. It's perform forced labor. Yeah. Why did I say tribute? Because of in the one of the tribes becomes Vayidla Masoved in Jacob's blessing of the tribes at the end of Genesis, and one of the understandings there, one of the commentaries there, or the interpretations, that means that tribe had to pay tribute to another king, according to a different story. So whatever it means, it's not pleasant. Any other comments about this section?
Do we know what happened to them eventually? The Canaanites? Did they get absorbed into the overall structure?
Yeah, so it depends on who you ask. So in some cases that for centuries, at least the way the story is told, there are still pockets of Canaanites living amongst the people. What I think when you look at archaeological evidence, you see that there's idolatrous Canaanite idolatry all throughout the ages. It's never really eradicated. So that would lead one to believe, Klaus, that they were always there, and that this is all kind of wishful rearranging of history, rewriting of history. Another possibility is that after hundreds of years, it just there's assimilation.
Yeah.
And so that's why this whole idea, when I started to learn about these things in the 80s, this whole idea of chosen peoplehood, and that we descend from this, and then realizing, and it always bothered me as a kid, how could I be, how could a blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid be Jewish, and dark complexion, different kind of nose, brown-eyed kid be Jewish? How does that work exactly? So I think we all know how that works, but and everybody coming up with their DNA and I'm this amount.
Yeah.
The amount of people, by the way, when they find out I'm a rabbi, have such an urgent need to tell me exactly what percentage of them are Ashkenazic Jews. I love that. That's always, Rabbi, you won't believe this. I'm 7% Ashkenazic Jews. Thank you for that. Means so much to me. I know that we have 7% more survival in the world. So I think it's a lot of different things. I don't know, Malka, do you have any comment about the eventual mixture of Canaanites amongst Israelite society?
I know some would say that the Israelites really were Canaanites, and that these stories were interwoven. Like there was a group that did experience some type of forced labor in Egypt, but they came and they made pacts and they became one people. But originally, the majority of the Israelites were Canaanites.
Right.
And the other thing is, I think that people begin to resemble the people that they live among. When you were talking about, how can a blonde haired, blue eyed person, well, how can a black hair, curly head person like me be? Because you resemble the people that you've lived among. Asian Jews look like Asians. You probably wouldn't be able to tell, right? The Jews in South America, many of them around Brazil, they look like Brazilians. So I'm never shocked by how any Jew looks.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. I don't think I ever look Swedish. but maybe I wasn't there long enough. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Malka.
Well, I'll tell you this: when I go home and see my family, I'm shocked how they look.
Why?
Because they're not tanned.
No, because they're shocking. They're just shocking people. I'm related to.
Okay, Richard. We're happy that we're here to support you. All right, Dan. I don't have any rabbinic text for you today, but I'll give you this one. Lots of good, juicy names. So we've just done now the first half of the Josephites, that is Ephraim, and now easily moving into the second half. And then you'll see how the three, Judah, Ephraim, and Mennasheh, we'll see in the weeks going forward, are different from the other tribes. And we'll take a look at that as well to see if all the other tribes get this amount of attention. Go ahead, Dan.
And this is the portion that fell by lot to the tribe of Mennasheh, for he was Joseph's firstborn. Since Machir, the firstborn of Mennasheh and the father of Gilad, was a valiant warrior, Gilead and Bashan were assigned to him. And now assignments were made to the neighboring Manassites by their clans, the descendants of Abiezer, Helek, Asriel, Shechem, Hefer, and Shemida. Those are the male descendants of Manasseh, son of Joseph, by their clans. Now Zelophehad, son of Hefer, son of Gilad, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, had no sons, but only daughters. The names of his daughters were Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. They appeared before the priest Eleazar, Joshua, son of Nun, and the chieftain, saying, God commanded Moses to grant us a portion among our male kinsmen. So in accordance with God's instructions, they were granted a portion among their father's kinsmen. 10 districts fell to Mennasheh, apart from the lands of Gilad and Bashan, which are across the Jordan. Manasseh's daughters inherited a portion of these together with his sons, while the land of Gilad was assigned to the rest of Manasseh's descendants.
Okay. Here's a great example, right, of when I ask, Klaus is usually Roberta when I want to encourage her when she's getting a little bit too bored with the details of the text. I said, but wait, let's look for some pearl inside of it. And here's a good example of you get this long list of things, and boom, this kind of break with a much richer, wider narrative. The really interesting times when this happens when we don't know about this narrative from any other place. Like when we find about Serach, daughter of Asher, in the middle of this boring list of 70 people, and suddenly, why is this daughter mentioned? We don't have any other text. We have it in Midrash. We have it maybe in ancient Midrash, and we learn from it that something else was told about. But here we happen to have the story, right? The story that I think everybody here knows from the book of Numbers, that talks about how these 5 daughters go and say to Moses, our father died not because he was sinning and he wasn't part of those that were punished by death because of different sins that were done. He died of his own sins, right? And that's it. It's an interesting story, often brought in as an example of early feminism in the Bible. I kind of always counter with the fact that at the end of Book of Numbers, somebody else brought another story that said, oh, by the way, all those 5 girls, they were married, those 5 daughters were married off to their uncles, which means essentially that the land went right back to where it would have gone anywhere, right? In other words, she has the women have no standing of their own, yet here it's repeated again. The fascinating thing here, though, is what's different here, Dan? Do you notice?
I don't know what you're referring to.
It's
Well,
not
the
happening in
is
front of
that
Moses.
God had decreed.
Okay.
It's relived again. It's almost like it's almost like an act, and it need to be played out in the new generation.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's one way of looking at it. Is it it's almost like a ceremony that needed to be done, kind of a renewal of vows, a renewal of promises, kind of a thing. Or it's just the author here, the editor wants to say, again, something we found all throughout the book of Joshua, don't think so much of Moses anymore. It's a new guy. There's a new sheriff. It's Joshua. It needs to happen in front of Joshua. And Eleazar.
Joshua was the only one that was there, right? That heard Moses' decree that they should inherit. So maybe he had to let everyone else know why they were inheriting.
If you want to stick to the historicity of the or the inner logic of the narrative, that would be important. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Some people are surprised to see Shechem as one of the sons here. That's other places as well. That just shows that it's a name that had multiple uses, right? It's not one name per person, right? Just like there's not one place name. It you know, as Richard just told us about New York, per state, it's also like there could be multiple people with the same name, even though it could be a non-Israelite and an Israelite, and who knows if that also reflects the thing we were talking about beforehand, that eventually Canaanites were, in the story, they were originally separate, but in reality, people came, same names, stayed.
One of his daughters was Noah. That struck me.
So,
One of the daughters of Selosbeth, her name was Noah.
right, and do you analyzed for yourself why it struck you, Noah?
Because Noah I thought was a male name.
Oh, but that's Noach.
Oh, what is this? Let me look at
His name
this.
is Noah with an ayin. And
Oh, okay, I got it. Yeah, because
while Chet and Ayin are
that they-
actually exchanged, for instance, in the Samaritan Targum, Aramaic Samaritan Targum, Chet and Ayin are often interchanged. It's almost humorous to see how easy, but they're both gutturals. Oh, Ayin and Chet, and we don't pronounce it that way, but Yemenites would pronounce it that way. You would hear it more with a Yemenite, a traditional Yemenite reading. Noah is an important name here, and I don't think you could know why, Malka, for the Lazar family, is we have 5 daughters, Sasha and I. I don't know if you
Mhm.
knew that.
Yeah.
And the 5th, who was born a few minutes after her identical twin sister, she therefore was the 5th of the daughters, making us parents of 5. Looked at Tzlofchad, and of all the names here, Noah was the nicest. I mean, in modern Hebrew, we actually know a Tirza. I met Sasha in her aunt Tirza's house, and she had another aunt Tirza that's an older name. I do know I have friends that named one of their daughters Tirza, but it's not done a lot, and they were very Orthodox at the time they did it. The other names are not great names for females in modern Israel. And then we found out afterwards that Noah was like the most given name for girls the year that our Noah was born. So there's a lot of Noahs.
I know Milka's.
Yeah,
Milk.
but you know of Milkas, but not Israelis who are our kids' age, right? You'll find it amongst Haredim and
Right.
maybe and perhaps other Orthodox, but not regular. Yeah. Noah is just far more popular. And you may know that Achinoam Nini, her stage name is Noah. Wonderful, wonderful performer, vocalist. Okay, so Milka, why don't you go ahead with 7 to 13 for us?
The boundary of Mennasheh ran from Asher to Mikmetoth, which lies near Shechem. The boundary continued to the right towards the inhabitants in Tapua. The region of Tapua belonged to Mennasheh, but Tapua on the border of Mennasheh belonged to the Ephraimites. Then the boundary descended to Wadi Kana. These towns to the south of Mennasheh lay north of the Wadi and ran on to the sea. What lay to the south belonged to Ephraim, and what lay to the north belonged to Mennasheh, with the sea as its border. This territory was contiguous with Asher on the north and with Issachar on the east. Within Issachar and Mennasheh possessed Beit Shean and its dependencies, Ibleam and its dependencies, the inhabitants of Dor and its dependencies, the inhabitants of Endor and its dependencies, the inhabitants of Taknach and its dependencies, and the inhabitants of Megiddo and its dependencies. These constituted 3 regions. The Menashites could not dispossess the inhabitants of these towns, and the Canaanites stubbornly remained in this region. When Israelites became stronger, they imposed tribute on the Canaanites, but they did not dispossess them.
Okay, so this is where we get to some of that translation, we'll get to that in a second, but before we get to the last part that connects us with the last part of Ephraim as well, this idea that part of it was not, you weren't able to totally clear the land of the Canaanites. Any comments?
Struck me what a patchwork it is. You think of the areas as being contiguous, but it's not. It's bits and pieces, not connected.
Right, so that's why it says three areas, I think, 3 regions. Let's go back to that map. Yeah, so the problem with these maps is that I don't see one. I didn't see a good one for just our chapter. That would be the real help. They probably exist someplace. Well, they do. In Achituv's book, they do, but it's in Hebrew. I should probably scan for the next. It's a very detailed maps, as opposed to these, which are not. Here you have the different areas, and it's very unclear, Yisachar and Zvulun, according to our text, where it really runs. It says where their boundaries run the same as theirs, but what Achituv mentions is that it was really very fuzzy. The boundaries to the north here were very, very fuzzy, in that at different times, different tribes seemed to be there, and there were families that might be mentioned in multiple tribes as well. Yeah, what else can I say?
It also strikes me, other reading and listening and doing other histories of other parts of the world, is that people can live among each other until they can't.
Yeah. Or until somebody else comes in from another place. Yeah.
Who's the one telling this story? Is this a scholar, or is this somebody going back 3,000 years?
So the one telling the story here, the biblical narrator here, is what was not living at the time of Joshua, even though it doesn't even purport to be Joshua at this point, because remember we had that, or 2 weeks ago we had that the thing where Joshua was old now. Well, if it says that Joshua was old now in the end of his days, and he wasn't able to complete the conquest, that's not Joshua speaking, that's another one. So the Talmud would attribute that to, I don't remember, it could be Samuel. There's only a few lines in the Talmud about who wrote what book of the Bible. It's not, wasn't really an important topic from a rabbinic point of view, as it became in modern scholarship. So modern scholars, some would say this was written, soon afterwards, and or soon afterwards being the time of Solomon. And other scholars would say it was written, hundreds and hundreds of years later, looking back and imposing an ideological view of what happened with the land. So we don't really know, Klaus, but it was, whatever it is, we've had the text the way it is right now for 2,300 years. It's at least that old. Right. Now, was the author a scholar? What are the nature of those that wrote biblical books? That's a fascinating topic. We have very little glimpse into that. One of the glimpses we have is from the book of Jeremiah, where he has his own scribe, his own private prophetic scribe of his prophetical works, whose name is Baruch, and so we know a little bit from that. One of my professors at Hebrew University, Menachem Haran, I don't remember. I would imagine he's no longer with us, but whatever, either he should live a long life, or may his memory be blessed. His expertise was, amongst other things, writing and scribal things in biblical times, calling all the different texts from biblical, from across the Hebrew Bible to tell us exactly what was done, whatever. I never really interested me so much. I think I may have a collection of articles devoted to that somewhere in my boxes of books. But he would talk about it. So in some circle, people would talk about, you've got those that were in the priestly circles. They were the scribes of those of the school of the priests, those that were dealing with the the sacrifices beforehand in other places, afterwards in Jerusalem. Then you've got the scribes that are in the royal court. They have a different style, right? And there's folk tales that are interwoven that were told around campfires. So it's a really complex, interesting, fascinating question. So now we get to this end that seems like a repetition of what we had beforehand, but you'll notice the words in the translation is different. They're reflected different in the Hebrew. I'm going to go up to the Hebrew. You can follow either in the Hebrew, the end, beginning of the bold part, or in the English. V'lo yachlu, and they were unable. B'nai Mennasheh, the Mennashehites were unable to conquer or to dispossess those cities. And here comes an interesting term, Vayoel HaKnani. Vayoel HaKnani here is translated, and the Canaanites stubbornly remained. Vayoel HaKnani Lashevet, stubbornly remained. I don't know, stubbornly to me seems like a rather laden term. There's a verse, Vayoel Moshe, and Moshe insisted upon, wanted to. I guess insistent is all right, but the stubbornly, it's almost like, we can't get rid of them. They need to go away already. How come they're not going away? Well, it's their land, it's their cities. And I know, look at Chevra, I know that I'm influenced by the news, and I'm influenced by my own politics about the land of Israel, or for that matter, in this country with indigenous people and their tribes. It's kind of like those people, and they just wouldn't leave. We did whatever they could for them to leave town, but they wouldn't leave. Those Chinese men that came here to build the railroads, and they wouldn't go back to China. All this kind of talk, it's disturbing. It's difficult. And so I'm not one to say, I'm not saying
Well, if they were to leave, where would they have gone?
That's a good question. Would have migrated to another land, right?
But then there's people there.
Or
those people are supposed to go.
Or there's less people, or there's more land, or they need cheap labor. I mean, it's kind of like, look at the world, right?
I just said, but that's the problem. When one group dispossesses another, it's like you go someplace. Where are they going to go other than, I guess they can go to Antarctica? I mean, there's nobody there.
Well, there are less people in the world, and they can go. You're talking about now, but no, that people could go to different places, and they may have skills that people didn't have. Maybe they know how to work agriculture that is needed in a new land. Or look at, how did Jews get to Sweden? There's a goldsmith that the king brought from a part of Germany, and that's how the first Jews got to Sweden in the 18th century. And he said, well, I can only come if I have a slaughter, a shochet, somebody to slaughter kosher meat. And not the first way, second way, we need a rabbi as well. So they had this little enclave of Jews at a time when, why would there be any Jews in Sweden whatsoever? Because they were needed there. And by the way, Sweden is the only country, I think, at least that's what we were told we were there, in the world, the only country in Europe where Jews were never thrown out of, right? And by the way, Klaus or whoever, and Malka, the issue of assimilation, those original Jewish families today, none of them are actively Jewish. Some are ostensibly Jewish. One of the members of that family, we've spoken about this before, is a friend of mine who's now a bishop in the Church of Sweden, Bonnier, and he's the most knowledgeable of his family about Judaism. His whole family was, by direction of the patriarch of the family in World War II, converted to Christianity because of the Nazis. There are some really interesting stories, some aristocrats, some wealthy Swedes that just were there for a long time. They were brought there because their skills were needed. Why you'll go in Tel Aviv, Richard, and you'll see Asian teenagers speaking fluent Hebrew, or in the army. So what is that about? No, they're not. More often than not, there are children of workers that came seeking employment in Israel over the last many, many decades, Philippines especially, and were born in Israel and stayed and became part of Israeli society because they had a skill that was needed. That's part of the economic crisis in Israel now that some of you perhaps read about, is that the fields and orchards are going unpicked because there's no. Once upon a time, the Israelis did it themselves in the 50s and 60s. Then came, certainly after 67, more and more Palestinian workers that would come in and do that kind of menial labor. And then after the intifadas and different things already in 2000, it was almost impossible for Palestinians to come back and forth as they could. So started to import workers from Thailand, construction workers from Poland, other places where you could get a better wage and send home, and that's how people stay in one place. Okay. You may know that
I think the Swedes were quite unusual because they really sided a little bit more with the Allies than the Axis, even though they were neutral. I mean, in many stories where Sweden helped Jews, not directly, but in what cases where Jews they bestowed Swedish citizenship on certain Jews in Germany, and they were then excused from going to camps. So behind the scenes, the Swedes were one of the countries interested in Jews, which I think is based on what you're telling us, how little there was in the country before is very interesting.
yeah, Raoul Wallenberg, as you know, is a name that comes up in that context. On the other hand, Klaus, what we learned being in Sweden, I think now is there were quite a few Swedish aristocrats, including the royal family, that were Nazi sympathizers. So there was a struggle going on between many people, like every place. It's never one, but yes, Sweden, although neutral. What we also learned when I was in Sweden is that basically Sweden was able to stay in that position because they supplied iron and wood for the Nazi war machine. So, but yes, we have those lovely stories and I don't want to. So getting back to this, let's finish up. Is that it feels to me reading this is these pesky, we can't get rid of them. We can't get rid of them. Here they are to this very day. Of course, what does this reflect? That at the time of this being written, there is at least a consciousness, regardless of what Malka told us before, and that perhaps they were all Canaanites. There's a consciousness that they are part of a society, from a society a cultural point of view. They're not us, and they stayed in the land. Why don't we just quickly finish up the last part? Megan, you want to leave the last part 14, 18 for us?
Right. The Josephites complained to Joshua, saying, "Why have you assigned as our portion a single allotment and a single district, seeing that we are a numerous people whom God has blessed so greatly? If you are a numerous people," Joshua answered them, "go up in the forest country and clear an area for yourself there in the territory of the Perizzites and the Rephaim, seeing that Rephaim, thanks. Seeing that you are cramped in the hill country of Ephraim. The hill country is not enough for us," the Josephites replied, "and all the Canaanites who live in the valley area have iron chariots, both those of Beth Shean and its dependencies, and those in the valley of Jezreel." But Joshua declared to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Mennasheh, "You are indeed a numerous people, possessed of great strength. You shall not have one allotment only. The hill country shall be yours as well. True, it's forest land, but you will clear it and possess it to its farthest limits. And you shall also dispossess the Canaanites, even though they have iron chariots and even though they are strong."
Okay, I think we're gonna go back to this next week. There's some interesting stuff here, of course. The bottom line that I'll leave everybody with right now is that the whole thing was flexible, right? There may have been this drawing of lots, this may have been this, but in the same way that the 2.5 tribes established themselves on the other side of the Jordan, that wasn't according to the plan. What this reflects is that the whole thing is in transition, movement. It's not a very this and this and this, as some texts, like the text in, before the request of the 2.5 tribes from Moses in Numbers leads us to believe it was there's a strand of Israelite tradition that wants us to believe that this was all God given, and therefore you have a God founded right to that land if that's where you live. That's on one hand. On the other hand is reality of doesn't always work that way, and there's got to be some flexibility. So let's go back to this. We'll start with this next time and then do the next chapter. Okay,
Thank you.
parting words? Okay, everyone. So we
Go
finished.
Jericho Jayhawks.
Okay, there's no Isaiah tomorrow. We finished the book of Isaiah. We're waiting for a few weeks, probably after Pesach. We'll start the Gospel according to John with Stephen Kinney, and that'll probably be at 11 on Thursdays, not at 10. But we'll put out a notice. And tomorrow and next Thursday are the last two in this particular mini course that I'm doing with Reverend Dan at St. Paul's. Otherwise, in person, Kabbalat Shabbat, and in person Shabbat morning at our house this week. Hope to see you. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.